Boris Johnson's written to every householder in the country today, effectively saying that things are going to get worse before they get better. Do you think a tighter lockdown is inevitable?
Well, the stakes couldn't be higher. This is about saving lives. And in order to save those lives, we need to have an economic response that makes sure that people are financially secure in their homes. And what the government's announced so far has been very welcome, but there are a number of gaps, and it's forced many workers and many self-employed people to choose between their health and their financial situation, and that's not acceptable. So, for example, this week, we know that Boris Johnson told us that we needed to stay in our homes and we should only leave to get essential provisions, to care for vulnerable relatives, or to go to work if we couldn't work from home. And when you look at the government's guidance on their website, it stated that if you can't work from home, essentially you should go to work. And they've stated that indeed it's important for business to carry on. Now, there are workers right across the country this week who've been going to construction sites, warehouses, call centres, where their health is being put at significant risk. And the government needs to now be very clear about what non-essential and essential work is, and make sure that those workers are at home if they're not providing an essential function and that they're financially protected.
So just to be clear then, are you effectively calling for all non-essential workplaces where work can't be done from home to be closed down effectively?
Certainly, when we see the pictures that we've seen this week in warehouses and building sites where workers are on top of each other, and we've heard reports, every single MP across the country will have had reports about workers who are frightened because they know that their colleagues have gone home sick with the suspected coronavirus. We know that people's lives are being put at significant risk, and that places further pressure on the NHS further down the line. So there's no excuse for those employers not to furlough those staff, because the government scheme is being made available to provide 80% of their wages. But there are a number of other deficiencies in the government's economic response, certainly in terms of making sure that that job retention scheme applies to all workers, particularly those who have reduced hours, to make sure that their full wage is covered. There's also an issue for the self-employed. Now, what the government outlined earlier this week was welcome, but many self-employed people have to wait till June to receive a payout from this, and that's not acceptable when we've seen other countries such as New Zealand roll out similar schemes far quicker. So we need the government to really make sure that resources are deployed into HMRC so that those self-employed people who are eligible can access that cash as quickly as possible and aren't forced to go to work. There's also a gap in terms of those self-employed people who aren't covered by the scheme, and when they're not, they're told to go and apply for universal credit at a rate of statutory sick pay, which is £94 a week. Now, £94 a week is not enough for anybody to live on, and the government has indeed admitted that themselves. So firstly, we need to have that amount increased so that it's enough to live on. But we also need the system that can provide the direct cash immediately, end the 5-week universal credit wait, and provide a grant rather than a loan to those workers and self-employed people who need to rely on that.
I just want to go back to the idea of whether or not businesses, non-essential businesses, should close or not. Are you worried about the balance between, of course, halting the spread of the virus, but also managing to keep the economy running in some form, particularly if all the evidence points that we may be in this situation for many months to come?
The most important thing in all of this is protecting human life. And every single decision that's made economically has to be centred around that. Now, we will recover. We will need to make sure that we have a huge investment and support package available after this crisis is over to really boost our economy and get things moving again. But at this time, the government's main priority should be ensuring that people are able to stay in their homes and that they're financially protected enough to do that.
Now, Jeremy Corbyn was on the programme last week. He welcomed the money that had been pledged for tackling the virus. He then suggested that it vindicated what he'd done at the last election. He said, "It's what I was condemned for asking for to deal with the scourge of poverty in Britain 3 months ago." So do you think that this kind of emergency financial rescue package shows that Jeremy Corbyn was right all along?
I think the crisis has highlighted how connected we all are to each other, and it also highlights the fragility of all of our lives. No matter what our job is, whatever our income is, We're one paycheck away from destitution in many cases. And it's also highlighted the dramatic underfunding of our NHS and public services to an extent that we weren't capable of being able to deal with a crisis such as this. So going forward, if we learn anything from this crisis, when we rebuild our economy, it has to be upon foundations that provide all of us with financial security and enough to live on. And it also provides the funding that our public services desperately need to deal with future crises such as this.
At the same time, though, do you think it's quite difficult to compare the arguments that we were rehearsing in the December election, which seems like a lifetime ago at the minute, with the emergency measures in the face of a global pandemic that is perhaps the worst health crisis since 1918?
Not at all. I mean, certainly what we've always been calling for are properly funded public services, and they weren't properly funded. They're still not, unfortunately. And we would have been in a better place to tackle this crisis if we had listened to the advice of medical advisors 3 years ago, for example, when they told the government that we needed to invest in protective equipment, advice that was ignored, unfortunately. We wouldn't have been in this position if we provided a safety net that was capable of catching people when they fell, with a benefit system that was enough for people to live on. And we wouldn't have been in this situation if we'd had stronger security for many of our workforce who were in extremely precarious situations, such as zero-hour contract workers and the self-employed.
The Labour leadership contest, of course, in which you were a contender, finishes in a week. Has sort of fallen away, of course, down the news agenda with everything with coronavirus. But if you win, would you be prepared to join a government of national unity if the Prime Minister asked you to?
Well, I've already been collaborating with the government and urging them to listen to my advice and the advice of my colleagues in tackling this crisis, because we want to be as helpful as possible. We're not criticising the government when we're offering our suggestions as to how this crisis can be better dealt with. We're trying to help, and that's what I'll do as leader, and that's what I'll do if I'm not leader, if I'm supporting a new leader.
Now, just one more question that I have to ask you as well. There's been lots of changes, of course, to the way that the leadership contest is run because of coronavirus. Is it right that you've been asked to record a victory video just in case? And isn't that going to be a little bit awkward?
I think it's trying to deal with these strange times and have an announcement on the leadership contest that our members and the public can view from their homes, really. It's logistically quite challenging. And I think we've all been asked to do this victory speech so that it can be sent out over the airwaves as quickly as possible after we win. I haven't done mine yet, by the way.
Are you going to feel a little bit awkward when you record it, though, before knowing the result?
It's going to be a bit bizarre, yeah.
I can imagine. Rebecca Long-Bailey, thank you very much for being on the programme.